It's been a while since I've shared a vintage pattern, so I decided to re-sew a design I've had for a while, Simplicity 8593, a 1940s reissued pattern with front and back tie closures, so no zippers or buttons. I'm sewing view D with the front V neckline and bottom ruffle. The last time I sewed this, I used a beautiful vintage floral cotton fabric, and today I'm using a pine bubble crepe. I'll link a couple different fabrics in the description, which would also be excellent for this pattern. Join me in sewing an oldie but a goodie. Let's get started. Here is the wrong side of my front bodice piece, and I'm going to start with the front pleats. I've transferred the pleat markings from the pattern piece onto the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to carry the bottommost line to the line above it and pin in place. Doing the same on both sides. Then I'll baste those pleats in place along the edges. Here is the wrong side of my back bodice piece, and I'm going to pin my darts. Now that my darts are pinned, I'll sew from the top to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so I can tie them in knots. Before I sew my front and back bodice pieces together at the shoulder seams, I'm going to finish those raw edges separately. First for the front piece, and then the same for the back. Then I'll place my front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. Then I'll sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. I've applied interfacing to the wrong side of both of my neckline facing pieces. Now I'll place them right sides together and pin the shoulders. Now I'll sew the facing shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open just as I did for the main bodice. Now I'm going to finish the entire outer edges all the way around. You can leave the facing edges finished as is, or you can choose to fold them to the wrong side along the finishing stitches and top stitch all the way around. Here are my front and back bodice pieces opened out away from each other at the shoulder seam. I'm going to start attaching the neckline facing. I'll place the facing and the bodice right sides together, aligning the shoulder seams and pinning in place. I'll also pin the front facing to the front bodice piece along the V that I've transferred from the pattern piece. And I'll continue pinning around the neckline. We're going to sew from one side of that top V around the neckline with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And along the stitching line for the front V, we're going to sew right along our transferred line. When we get to the bottom of the V, we'll sew one horizontal stitch, then sew along our stitching lines on the other side to meet the neckline stitches. Once you're done stitching all the way around, you can reinforce the bottom of the V, stitching right on top of the original stitches in that bottom section. Now we're going to slash through the center of the V from the top to the point, being very careful not to clip through your stitching line at the bottom of the V. I'm going to trim the seam allowance around the neckline, as well as trimming the top corners around my stitching. We're going to understitch the facing along the neckline as well as the front V. Around these center front corners, your presser foot won't allow you to understitch all the way to the corner, so stop and start your stitching around those center front corners. For the V, we're going to turn our facing over the seam allowance, and sew the facing to the seam allowance underneath as close to the stitching line as possible. We'll do the same for the neckline, turning the facing over its seam allowance, sewing the neckline facing to that seam allowance underneath, once again stitching close to the seam line on the facing side. Now that that's understitched, we can turn the facing entirely to the inside of the garment and give those sections, the front V and the neckline, a good press. Now that that's pressed, to finish off the neckline, I want to stitch the facing to the shoulder seams on the inside of the garment. Making sure that the shoulder seam of the facing and the shoulder seam of the bodice perfectly align, I'm going to use a needle and thread to hand tack the bottom of the facing to the shoulder seam on both sides. And I'll secure my facing in place on the inside in the same way for the opposite shoulder seam. For each of your side ties, fold them in half right sides together and sew along that long edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, doing this for both pieces. Turn both of the ties right side out. Tuck one of the short edges back inside the tube. Now that those raw edges are concealed on one side, I'm going to hand sew it closed and repeat for both ties. Here is the right side of my back bodice piece, and I've transferred the dots indicating where the back ties will be placed. I'll align the raw unfinished short edges of each tie with the dots and pin in place. And I'll sew them in place at a 5/8 inch seam allowance to secure. Now for the side seams from the bottom of the back piece all the way up across the shoulder seams and to the bottom edges of the front piece, we're going to form a narrow hem along those sides. So for those entire side edges, I'm going to fold the raw edges to the wrong side by a 1/4 inch, then once more by an additional 1/4 inch, and I'll edge stitch that in place along that inner fold, doing this for both side seams. Now the side seams are finished with a narrow hem, we're also going to do a narrow hem along the bottom of the back piece only. I'm going to fold those edges to the wrong side in the same way by a 1/4 inch, then again by an additional 1/4 inch, and you can pin that in place. Then we'll edge stitch in place along that upper inner fold from one side all the way to the other. Here is the unfinished bottom edge of my front bodice piece, and I'm going to attach the inset, placing the inset right sides together with the front bodice and pinning them together along the bottom edge. Note that since the side edges of our bodice are finished, the raw edge of the inset will extend 5/8 of an inch beyond those side edges. And you have dots on your pattern pieces that you can match at those side edges. Sew this seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'll trim that seam allowance. Clip into the curves. And I'll press that seam down toward the inset. Here is the wrong side of my front ruffle piece, and we're going to finish the bottom and side edges in the same way as we finished the side seams on the bottom of the back bodice for the bodice piece, forming a narrow hem along the side and bottom and edge stitching close to the inner fold. Now with the side and bottom edges finished, we can gather the top edge. We'll start gathering at one notch with the longest stitch on our machine, continuing those gathering stitches straight across to the notch on the other side. Leave tails of thread on both ends so you have threads to pull for gathering. Place the basted edge of your ruffle right sides together with the inset, matching the centers and the other notches, and pin in place. Match the finished edges of the ruffle with the dots transferred from your pattern piece, which should mean that the finished edge of the ruffle will be 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of the inset. Gather the ruffle evenly until it fits perfectly along the inset and pin in place. Baste the ruffle to the bottom of the inset from one side to the other. For both of the tie end pieces, we're going to form narrow hems for the bottom, the top, as well as the slanted edges. Repeat for both tie end pieces. I finished each of my long edges and the slanted edges, and while at the machine, I also basted the short ends for both pieces. Now I'll pull those basting stitches along the short edge of the tie end and place it right sides together with the short edge of the inset, matching the dots and pinning in place. Repeat to attach both of the tie ends to the inset. Baste those tie ends in place. For the remaining inset piece, we're going to fold and press this top curved edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch all the way across. Now we can start attaching the remaining inset to the front bodice piece. I'm going to lay my ties on top of the bodice piece, and I'm also going to turn the ruffle upward so it's laying on top of the inset. Now you should have full access to the seam allowances on either side of the inset. Now we'll place our remaining inset right sides together with the opposite inset so that the ruffle and the ties are sandwiched in between. Pin along the side and bottom edges. And sew these side and bottom edges with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I'll trim the seams that I just sewed, as well as trimming those bottom corners. Then we can turn this inset facing to the inside of the garment. And then lastly, working from the inside of the garment, we're going to place that top edge of the inset that we pressed to the wrong side earlier, placing it over the main seam line of the main inset so that it just covers those stitches, and slip stitch in place all the way across. And now your vintage top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.